So we finished up John last week after a many month-long journey through that book. And now we're starting our summer series. And I know, there's at least 3 people in this room who are like, it is not technically summer yet. And I get it. But like Memorial Day's in the background, right? So we're moving on with summer. And the series for the summer is Poisonous Platitudes. Now, I don't get to see these slideshows until I'm here, and so it's always a treat for me. I like this one. This is great. But when I was sharing with Stephanie about this series yesterday, Imogen, my 3-year-old daughter, heard me and said, "Poisonous platypus?" And you know what? I now know what I want the art for this series to be. I'm gonna reach out to like one of my illustrator friends and see if we could get a poisonous platypus to be on the slideshows. Now, well, what you do in your own time. But I want to talk about something kind of serious before we get into like the meat of this series. And before I get there though, I want to talk about this is helpful. Each one of these things we're going to be talking about can at different times, in different seasons, for different people, be helpful. You know what they say about poison? Don't ask me who said this. I don't know who originated it, but it's often not the poison itself that kills you, right? It's the dosage, right? A couple of our friends with medical backgrounds are like, yeah, very deep, Giuseppe. And so there have been seasons in my life where I found this to be very helpful. And if you say this, if you find this helpful, my goal is not to diminish you in any way. Each one of these things in the weeks ahead are going to have that kind of component. In fact, I'm going to be tackling one that we say all the time in this church, that we love in this church. I'm going to be tackling some of the ones that I really love. My hope is that we go deeper than a cliche, and that we can be aware of what could be toxic about it, you know? Because I do think there is a flip side to these things. I also want to point out we are a non-dogmatic church. What that means is we have many different views in this room. And so if you disagree with my view, that's okay. I don't want you to feel any kind of pressure from me, but I'm going to speak to what I find to be true. I'm going to speak to my understanding. We could always have a conversation outside of this, okay? I'm not threatened by that. In fact, I really enjoy those kinds of conversations. 12 years ago, almost 12 years ago, I got a phone call from a friend that our mutual friend, Will, had died. It was actually on my very last day of work at Capital One. So I had completed my first semester at seminary. There's a couple of people here who know I went to Claremont, but before I went to Claremont, I did most of my first half of credits at George Fox Evangelical Seminary. It's now called Portland Seminary. And I transferred. And I'm really glad I got to do that. Got to transfer. And I met some great people at George Fox. But we kind of met an impasse. And I was so excited to be finishing up my career at Capital One and returning back into ministry. But I knew I had a lot of learning to do. And so, you know, I'm packing up my stuff. I've got some goodbye notes that I have for my coworkers. And I get this phone call. Hey, Giuseppe, Will took his own life. And that's a lot to carry. It's a lot to carry to work with you. So I went. It was a very emotional day for me. I came home and I packed my bags and I drove to Boise, Idaho. And I met with his family and a bunch of friends who knew him. I was 2 years older than Will, but I was actually Will's youth pastor. In the tradition I grew up in, youth pastors started very early. And I did my first full-time vocational ministry in Boise. And then he became a grown-up, and we became friends. He wanted to, he actually wanted us both to go do a few months over in Italy, working in a boatyard, where we had shipped barnacles, like shaved barnacles off of boats. And I turned him down on that, and I went to Japan instead. And I lived in Japan for a while. And I don't regret that decision at all. I get seasick, and I also don't like shaving anything off of boats, let alone barnacles. Those things are a little scary. So we go to the funeral for Will. And we listen to one sharing after another that was about this deep. His father-in-law, because he had just gotten married 2 years earlier, gets up and talks about, like, hey, Will was such a committed Christian that he recanted from his heretical past, where he was taking depression medication and threw it away. And he stopped seeing a counselor because those are of the devil. You know, you just need God. And the worship pastor got up, and the worship pastor talked about nobody worshiped God as hard as Will. The music would end, and for 10 to 15 minutes after the service, Will would still be standing there in silence with his arms raised high. It's beautiful until you realize Will was despairing. He was despairing, and the people around him were calling that, like, they couldn't see it, except for his family, who desperately tried to get him to get on back on a medication and counseling. And then he had a 1-year-old little girl. And he went on a walk 1 week before they were supposed to go out into the mission fields. They're going to be missionaries with their church. And he was so overwhelmed. He despaired so greatly for that moment on the Boise Greenbelt, for those of you familiar with that town, that he ended his life. And then his pastor gets up and says, we know this is all for the glory of God and those who love him, because everything works together for good. God is working everything for the good of those who love him, which is the passage we just read. And that could be a really comforting passage unless you don't fit the category of those who love God, according to who's preaching that passage, right? Then it's bad news for you. Luckily, this pastor still saw Will as included in, like, the love of God. That's great. But by implication, this is all part of God's design. God is in control, is what we usually mean when we say everything happens for a reason. And sometimes that can help us release things we can't control. And often it can be a bludgeon. I don't believe that God did this to Will. I don't believe this is part of some great ineffable plan of God to have either caused Will to end his life or to have not prevented it in some way if God's God could. But I do want to address like this passage that we are looking at, and I do want to address Bible tradition in this way. As I've said often from the front here, the Bible is not monolithic. It's many different books that all have different perspectives. Now, Wednesdays, I'm going through like a series on the Hebrew Bible with folks. It's kind of fun. We have been spending like 5 weeks in Genesis, and there's a lot of messed up, weird stuff in there. It is wild. It is wild. And I think if we can allow the Bible to be weird, to be wild, we can allow it to speak with greater integrity. You know? So, in the book of Genesis, during the flood story, before God wipes the plate clean, destroys humanity with the flood, God looks at humanity, sees that it's grown greatly evil, and what does God do? God regrets what God has made. Does that sound like a God who's completely in control, according to the writer of Genesis? No, there's other factors at play than just God in that story. Later, the people of the world, they've repopulated, they've built a city, and they decided, hey, let's build a giant tower that goes all the way up to heaven. And God's like, uh-oh, this is a problem. We have to scatter them now. God changes the plan, right? Later on, we have God giving commandments, and often the people reject the commandment. Again and again and again. It's one of the major themes in the Hebrew Bible. You look at Exodus and Numbers, you look at 1st and 2nd Samuel, 1st and 2nd King, Joshua, Judges. God says, hey, I want you to just worship me. Those other places, they have other gods, don't worship them. Just me. And the people are like, nah, I don't want to do that. And God's like, well, I'm going to punish you then, is often what God does. And I have issues with that depiction of God too. Big issues. This is not a God who's completely in control all the time of everyone and everything, always and forever. People rebel against God. And sometimes God's surprised by it. Can we allow for a God that can be surprised by things? I don't know. Can we allow for a God that maybe doesn't always get God's way? So this continues to happen throughout the prophetic writings. So these are people who go to their leaders or to their society and they say, y'all are missing the point. The point is not how much are you giving God, but rather how much are you taking care of the folks around you, especially the marginalized. If you're not doing those things, you've missed what God really cares about. So these writers, I think, have a great bone to pick with other depictions of God as greatly concerned with those in power, missing that God is actually, according to their perspective, greatly concerned with those who are suffering. And it says, those texts often say, God is with those people. God picks favorites, and it's them, actually, because they're the ones who need God the most. Because the rest of us are stealing blessings from them. We're stealing from them. They need a champion. And even though God's their champion, what continues? The oppression. Sometimes God doesn't get God's way. You go to the New Testament, and we see this theme as well. In fact, it's part of why Jesus is even there, isn't it? Folks have this apocalyptic desire for God to intervene into the course of history and change everything. It's not so different than many folks today who are like, oh boy, I can't wait for the world to end tomorrow because I'm in a lot of suffering And I would really like that to happen, because then everything's going to be great. That's not a new desire. Sometimes we just feel at our end. We feel hopeless. We can't imagine tomorrow in our world, the way it is, being better than today. And what do the New Testament writers desire? What do they see happening? Well, they see Jesus and they hope. They believe that Jesus is God's interruption somehow. That maybe a better world is possible. Maybe this is the start of it. And Jesus teaches folks to pray. And what do they pray? The Lord's Prayer, which we do a version of every week. Our Father and Mother who art in heaven, hallowed be thy name. Thy kingdom come, thy will be done. Why are we praying for God's will to be done? Isn't that kind of an acknowledgement that God's will is sometimes not done? Right? We're committing ourselves to trying to do better, to trying to be in line with what we see as God's will. And by that, we're denouncing those things that we see as not God's will. So if we see God as a God of love, we're working for love. Right? And then we've got our Romans text. I told you I'd come back to it, so I'm coming back to it. And I want to point out, Romans starts off, Romans 1, written by Paul, starts off in the very first chapter. God made humanity, God had a desire for humanity, and humanity did not do it. Sometimes I think we have to acknowledge that things happen and it's not part of God's plan. This is what I would advocate for. This is how I see things. Doesn't mean that's how you have to see things. I used to see this as helpful, and I don't anymore, but I do want to share what I do find helpful. To my Claremont friends in the back, did you know that Claremont School of Theology is like one of the hubs for process theology? Yeah. Most of us don't know what that is, and that's totally fine, but I find it to be a helpful way of just trying to understand how God works in the world. Every attempt at theologizing is an act of interpretation. Dan, you and I were talking about process theology last week, so you did put a little bit of a bug in my ear on this. So if this is clunky, I blame me, but you are my inspiration. I appreciate it. So, process theology would say, everything happens for a reason, but that reason might not be God, it might be any of a number of causes. God does not work over all things for our good, but rather God works alongside all things and with all things for our good. And in fact, that is an alternate interpretation for the passage that we started with. It is a little difficult to... Can we put it back up there? So it can be understood as, we know that all things work together for good for those who love God, but it can also be read as, in the Greek, we know that God works in all things for the good of those who love God. That's not a natural, easy to wrap your mind around distinction. But in one thing, God is like the master planner, and the other thing, God is working through it all. One sees God as schemer, plotter, and in control. The other sees God more as partner, if you can think of it that way, working with what's happening. God is not the only factor. Not all things cooperate, but God is a big factor. God calls us to and tries to persuade us to the good and is busy about this work with all other things also. You can kind of think of this as what we've talked about in previous weeks, how John sees the Holy Spirit. It's God with us, in partnership with us, walking alongside us. In fact, that word we often translate as companion or advocate literally means come alongside her, somebody who walks next to us. But things get in the way. We aren't always able to hear clearly. We have many other voices vying for our attention. We have baggage, we have trauma, we have biology. We have needs and we have wants, and somewhere in that mix is God working next to us, trying to make the best of the situations we find ourselves in. And if I apply this to Will's life, I can let God off the hook a bit. When I ask God, where were you when Will was suffering? The answer is, God was with Will every step of the way. God walked next to Will. God encouraged Will. I think God was speaking through his family saying, please get back on your medication. Please don't cut us off. Please get back into counseling. But that's not the only voice. And I think if we look at our lives during some of our hard moments, maybe this helps us let God off the hook a little bit in that respect too. But that does kind of mean we have to face difficult realities beyond our control. And I think that's one of the greatest things that's appealing about this statement. Because at the heart of things, we find this comforting because we want some level of control. And if we can't control it ourselves, we want to think that God will do it for us. Right? And I would encourage us to maybe consider approaching God, approaching life a different way. Who here knows the Serenity Prayer? Would someone like to say it? There is. I think part of why we find that helpful is because we're acknowledging there are things beyond our control. It doesn't matter how hard we pray, those things are still going to dog us, right? We're also acknowledging that those are not the only things that exist. There are also things that are within our control. And one of the other aspects of that prayer that I like is this idea of God as not just accompanier, but as helper. So where is God? Where is God when you need God? Well, for those theists in the room, God is next to you. God is with you. God is helping you. And for you non-theists in the room, I don't want to, I love you all very much too. We'll continue to show up alongside each other too. Because that's how we get through hard times. We get through hard times with each other and with the help of God. All right, this one is a bit of a downer. But I wanted to start with the one that always comes to my mind first when I think of an unhelpful cliche or a potentially hurtful cliche. Next week is going to be, I don't know, I hope a little bit more fun. It's one that I grew up hearing all the time. God said it, I believe it, that settles it. That's our poisonous platitude for next week.